Hello, my name is Elliott. I'm the editor of Personal Finance as well as the Energy Strategist and co-editor of MLP Profits with Roger Conrad. Today I want to talk a little bit about an industry that I think just doesn't get a lot of attention, doesn't get enough attention from investors, and that's agriculture. Most people don't think of agriculture as really a high-tech industry group at all, but the fact is that it's one of the most high-tech industries around. The gains in yield, in other words, how much crop can be produced per acre of land, has really been the key to the world's development for a couple of centuries now. If you consider that back in 1800, the world population was less than 1 billion people, and farmers in many even developed countries made up more than 50% of the workforce, people involved in the agricultural industry, compared to today where it's maybe 1 or 2% of the population engaged in agriculture. But we're feeding a lot more people. We have more than 6 billion people around the world. The other thing to look at is the concept of food upgrading. In other words, it's not so much that people eat more food as they become wealthier. It's that the type of food that they eat changes very dramatically. For example, if you look at a country like China, 30 years ago, Chinese consumers consumed very little meat, very little sweets and oils. Really, most of their diet was based around basic staple products, things like grain, rice, etc. But as countries become wealthier, what tends to happen is meat consumption rises a lot faster than overall calorie intake. In other words, calories do increase, the number of actual calories consumed per day. But what really grows quickly, much quicker than the overall calorie growth, is consumption of meat. Now, producing meat is extremely agriculture intensive. That's because, if a consumer eats just a kilogram of grain, it takes 7 times that amount in some cases to produce the same kilogram of beef. Therefore, rising meat consumption spells an exponential rise in the amount of grain demand that's going on worldwide. The other major source of demand for agricultural products these days is biofuels. Yesterday, on Tuesday, December 1st, a letter was released by a prominent ethanol lobby. Ethanol, of course, in the United States is a biofuel. It's basically an alcohol mixed with gasoline, and it's actually distilled from corn right now, mainly. In Brazil, ethanol is produced from sugarcane. But in the United States, there's been a maximum allowable blend rate of ethanol. In other words, what percentage of gasoline can be made up of ethanol, of 10%. Basically, refiners are putting about 10% of every gallon of gasoline that you pump is actually ethanol, not gasoline derived from petroleum products. The problem is that there's also a mandate that was passed by Congress back in 2007 that says by 2012, U.S. refiners have to mix over 15.2 billion gallons of ethanol into the U.S. gasoline supply. Now, what they didn't think of back in 2007 was that U.S. gasoline demand might actually drop, as it has over the last couple of years. Now, the reason it's dropped is twofold. One, of course, the recession in the U.S., and the other, of course, being much higher than expected gasoline prices. Now, as I've said many times in the Energy Strategist, this is all to be expected. U.S. and more broadly, developed world demand for gasoline is going to have to be flat to slightly negative if all these developing countries like China and India are going to consume more oil. Because supplies of oil globally are quite limited. But what we're seeing in the U.S. is that gasoline consumption is flat to declining. And at 10% blend rates, you will never see 15 billion gallons plus of ethanol blended with the U.S. gasoline supply by 2012. The fact is it's just impossible. It's mathematically impossible. So what's happened is that a couple of ethanol producing companies or lobby groups have actually petitioned the EPA to raise the ethanol blend rate from 10 to 15%. Now, a letter released yesterday that came from the EPA, written to one of these ethanol lobbying groups, actually seemed to indicate very, very strongly that the EPA is favorably disposed to making that ruling by the middle of next year. Now, what that means is that instead of blending just 10% ethanol with gasoline, what we call E10, we're going to go to potentially E15 in the United States. That's a lot more corn that needs to be grown to produce that ethanol. In fact, 1 out of every 3 bushels of corn produced in the United States, which is the world's largest corn producer, 1 out of every 3 bushels of corn already goes to the ethanol industry. This is just going to increase that. Looking out broadly around the world, we're not the only country in the world that has mandates for biofuel use. The same situation in the European Union. Another common biofuel is something called biodiesel. It's produced from essentially canola oil, canola oil is actually oil produced from rapeseed. It's also can be produced from soybean oil. And more commonly in recent years has been to produce it from something called palm oil, which is oil produced from the kernels of a particular type of palm tree, mainly grown in Malaysia and Indonesia. So we really have two major demand forces acting on agricultural products longer term. One, food upgrading from developing countries, and two, mandated biofuel use primarily from the developed world. Now, in order for this all to work out, the key is yield. The problem is that the supply of arable land around the world is actually shrinking. A lot of places around the world, for example in China, what was marginally arable land is now desert or near desert, and therefore not really cultivable. The key again is yield. In other words, how many bushels of corn or wheat can you grow per acre of land? There are a couple of ways that you can boost yield. One, better fertilization techniques. We've seen a humongous jump in demand for fertilizer from China in recent years as they're applying fertilizer more logically than they used to, and that's helping to boost yields. Another one, genetically modified seeds. Very controversial in some parts of the world, often derided as sort of Frankenfood, but the reality is it's quite necessary. Some of the new genetically modified seeds being released today will allow crops to, you can apply less pesticide because they're resistant to insects. You can apply herbicide to kill weeds and boost yield. And some of the newer GM foods being developed will actually be resistant to things like drought, which again is a major problem. Lack of water in many parts of the world is a major problem for farmers. So yield again is the key to allowing the world to grow all this food that it needs, all this grain that it needs on a shrinking supply of arable land. This is a major theme that I've been covering in The Energy Strategist for several years now. I first started writing about this back in 2005 and 2006. It's also something that I have been covering and will be covering in more depth in Portfolio 2020, a newsletter I contribute to which Roger Conrad edits. And again, some of the key areas to look at: fertilizer, particularly companies that produce a fertilizer known as potash. Also some of the genetically modified seed companies. The biggest in the world is a company called Monsanto, symbol MON. Another area that I've been covering in great depth and actually is featured in this issue of The Energy Strategist is companies that produce palm oil. Again, as I mentioned, palm oil is a key input used in biodiesel. It also happens to be the #1 edible oil in China. And again, as I mentioned, as Chinese become wealthier, they're consuming more fats and oils. Most of the world's palm oil plantations are located in Malaysia and Indonesia. And there are a handful of European companies primarily listed in London, that have locked up a large amount of those palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia. So again, agriculture is an area that I think just doesn't get enough attention, and those are some of the areas to look at going forward. Thank you very much.